Welcome to our deep dive. We're starting today with something a little counterintuitive, an observation that really challenges how we tend to talk about global mobility.
It does. I think the default assumption in almost every migration debate is that people move towards the highest quality of life.
Mhm.
Simple as that.
Right? They're chasing the top of the comfort rankings. The best healthcare, the lowest crime rates, the most income equality.
It's the logical assumption, isn't it? If you're going to make this huge life-altering sacrifice and move across the globe, you'd think you'd aim for, say, Norway or Switzerland.
Exactly. And that's where this gets really interesting. Because if chasing that top tier comfort was the main driver, we would expect to see African migration flocking just overwhelmingly to places like Luxembourg, Norway, or Switzerland.
The countries that consistently score higher than the United States on nearly every single quality of life metric.
But that's not what we see. When you look at the observable patterns, the United States remains this incredibly powerful, consistent magnet for a really large share of African migration.
And that contradiction, the pattern we see versus the one we'd expect, it forces you to look beyond those traditional metrics. The sources we're looking at suggest the real answer isn't in comfort rankings. It's in a completely different structural idea: access.
So that's the core argument we're exploring today. And we want to be clear, this is framed as an opinion feature. We're looking at observable patterns.
The idea being that for a majority of African migrants, it's structural accessibility that dictates their destination far more than high living standards.
And we really need to frame that carefully. This is an exploration of the broad logic affecting a large share of migrants, not a claim about every single person's journey. Everyone's story is unique.
Of course, but it's an essential discussion. It helps explain the why behind these massive population movements, looking at the structural reality, not just, romanticizing individual dreams.
And as we go, we really want to hear what you think. You might fundamentally disagree with this whole perspective, and that is absolutely part of the conversation we're hoping to start.
Please challenge the idea. That's what this is for.
Okay, so let's start where most people do. GDP per capita, global wealth rankings. Why do these figures, which seem to scream prosperity, often not predict where migrants actually go?
Well, what's fascinating is just digging into what that data actually measures. GDP per capita tells you how wealthy a country is on average. It describes life after you've already successfully entered and integrated.
But the decision to migrate, that's made long before you ever step foot in the country.
That's the whole point. Migration decisions are made before the first plane ticket is bought, before the first border is crossed.
So the data is describing this beautiful luxury hotel, but it's not telling you anything about the bouncer at the door.
Or the cost of the key card, exactly.
Yeah.
The critical gap in these rankings is that they fail to measure three things that are vital to a potential migrant
Which are?
who can realistically get in,
Mm-hmm.
under what specific conditions, and, maybe most importantly, with what margin for error.
Okay, so take an example.
Take Luxembourg. It often tops the global wealth rankings. Amazing standards. But if its entry rules require, say, immediate, specialized EU-level professional qualifications or citizenship to regularize,
Then all that wealth is functionally irrelevant to a young person in Accra or Lagos who's just looking to get a foothold.
it's a closed door. The sources argue migrants aren't ignoring the data. It's more that the rankings themselves are incomplete. They're not irrelevant. They're just not the full picture for understanding the flow of people.
The promise of wealth doesn't mean much if the path to get there is structurally impassable for you.
That is it, precisely.
Which brings us to this core distinction we need to make: the difference between living standards and accessibility. How should we define those two for our listener?
Living standards, that's the easy one. Answers the question, how well do people live once they're inside the system?
So that's the comfort layer. Quality of life, social safety nets, stability, good public services, the high bar destinations.
Correct. But then there's accessibility, and that answers a much more fundamental question, especially for someone whose journey is inherently risky, who can realistically get in and actually stay. That's all about the possibility of entry, the different pathways available, and, critically, the margin for error the system allows.
Let's look at those ultra-high living standard European states then. Norway, Switzerland, those smaller, wealthier EU nations. Their systems seem designed for one thing above all else: certainty, stability.
They are. These systems typically require things like immediate EU citizenship or a confirmed specialized job sponsor, and that's often coupled with strict language tests and proof of financial stability. The sources describe these as systems that favor certainty and productivity over, say, absorption and flexibility.
And I think that's the key mechanical difference between these political systems, right?
Yeah.
A strict system wants to make sure anyone who enters can slot immediately and productively into a very highly regulated society.
Yes. While a flexible system is built, maybe unintentionally, to absorb a bit of uncertainty, to allow for some imperfection.
And it's not a moral judgment. It's not better or worse.
No, not at all. We should be using comparative language here. These European nations are just more regulated, more predictable, and often less tolerant of irregularity.
So for a migrant, those high standards, they function less like stepping stones.
And more like walls. Walls that only really open for people who are already arriving in a state of near perfection.
That structural rigidity really gets to the heart of our next point. Why those very rich European states tend to attract fewer African migrants. And again, this isn't about hostility, it's about system design.
It's entirely structural. I mean, think about the mechanics. These are often small countries with limited population sizes. Their overall need for new labor is contained and usually highly specialized.
And they have these incredibly tightly regulated labor markets, which is great for maintaining high wages and standards for people already inside.
But it also creates very high regulatory thresholds for anyone trying to get in.
So if you're a highly skilled, certified electrical engineer with all the right paperwork, you might be exactly who they're looking for.
You might be. But if you're coming with a broader skill set, or maybe without internationally recognized documents, the door is effectively closed no matter how rich the country is.
And there's little tolerance for informal work, right? Which, for a new arrival, is often the first and only way to get immediate income.
Exactly. And beyond that, there are often very few, or even no, pathways to regularize your status if something goes wrong. If your visa lapses or you miss a bureaucratic deadline, the system often has no mechanism to catch you, to let you reset.
The sources call it a binary system.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
You are either legal and productive or you are excluded.
And for migrants whose journeys are defined by uncertainty, needing to try different jobs, needing to build things up gradually, that rigidity is prohibitive.
It is. But again, this doesn't make these countries hostile or bad. It just makes them inherently selective. They're pursuing a goal of maximum internal stability, and that goal necessarily limits accessibility.
Their prosperity and their tight regulation are really just two sides of the same coin.
Absolutely. So the lack of migration isn't because people are unaware of the prosperity. It's because they're rationally responding to the lack of a structural foothold.
Okay, let's pivot now to the big comparison, the United States. We often describe the U.S. in pretty neutral terms. We acknowledge the stark inequality, the chaotic politics, all the challenges.
Right.
But structurally, in this global migration equation, it functions completely differently.
It really does. If those wealthy European nations are systems designed for certainty, the U.S., for all its chaos, functions as a system that allows entry without immediate perfection.
That's a powerful way to put it.
Mm.
But how does that flexibility avoid just becoming a system of cheap, easily exploited labor? If it's easier to get in without being perfect, doesn't that make the migrant more vulnerable?
And that's the critical tension. The sources don't ignore that at all. Vulnerability is a huge risk in the U.S. system. But the system's sheer size and its variety, they create pathways that don't exist elsewhere.
Okay, let's list them. What are the mechanisms that enable this access?
Well, first, just the sheer number of official pathways. You have the diversity visa lottery, family sponsorships, study visas, work visas, asylum claims. Even if they're contested, they are entry points.
And the labor market itself is just on a different scale.
It's vast. It's so diversified. You've got millions of jobs at every single skill level, from high-tech to agriculture to a massive service sector.
Which means the time to income for a new arrival can be much shorter.
Much shorter. And we have to acknowledge the historical tolerance for informality. It's legally very complicated, of course, but it does provide a necessary cushion for people to find their footing.
And you cannot overlook the diaspora networks.
Absolutely not. The U.S. has these massive, mature African diaspora communities that act as immediate social and economic safety nets. They absorb newcomers, they find them housing, give them job leads, offer advice.
So to synthesize the point, the U.S. isn't necessarily easier to live in. It's expensive and it's deeply unequal.
But it is demonstrably, structurally easier to begin in.
And that idea, easier to begin, that feels key to understanding migration through what our sources call survival logic. We love to romanticize migration as chasing the American dream, but the real decision-making is far more practical.
It's rational risk management. For so many African migrants, the motivation is profoundly survival-driven. It's about fulfilling family responsibilities back home. The guiding question is almost never, where will life be perfectly comfortable?
It sounds more like the guiding question is, where is there enough space for me to try? And, just as important, to potentially fail without being completely ruined.
That's it. That space to try serves profoundly practical needs. We see it across so many African diasporas. They need the space to work multiple jobs, sometimes informally, to maximize what they can earn.
They need to be able to rely on community networks right away before they can navigate the state bureaucracy.
And, most critically, they need to be able to send remittances home early, sometimes within weeks of arriving. They need a chance to gradually regularize their status over time. That room to fail without immediate expulsion is everything.
So if you compare that to the rigid European model, where you might spend 6 months waiting for a work permit before you can even think about sending money home.
The U.S. structure, for all its flaws, offers speed and flexibility. And that is essential survival logic. The destination gets chosen because it's, for lack of a better word, forgiving of a gradual arrival.
The logic is, I can handle chaos and inequality if I have a foothold, but I can't survive a system that demands immediate perfection when my starting point is anything but.
Exactly. And this reframing is so important because it shifts our focus away from blaming migrants or judging countries and towards just analyzing how these global systems are structured.
Which brings us to the open questions we want to leave with you, the listener, because this perspective, it really changes the whole debate.
It does. If we accept this premise that structural access often matters more than comfort rankings, what does that mean for how we design systems globally?
So first we have to ask, is accessibility fundamentally more important than comfort in the global migration structure, especially when survival is the main driver?
Second, and this is a big one, should migration systems in rich countries be designed to allow for imperfect entry, to absorb uncertainty? Or is that strict control necessary to protect the living standards their citizens expect? That's a real trade-off.
And if the wealthiest, most restrictive countries are limiting their intake, are they just unintentionally exporting that global migration pressure somewhere else?
Right, pushing it towards the few remaining systems of access, like the U.S.
And that leads to the final question. Is the U.S. unique in its chaotic function? Or is it simply the last flexible system big enough to absorb this global pressure that's being turned away by the high-standard, low-access nations?
These are real structural choices that policymakers have made, and we really encourage you to think about them, to disagree, to discuss. We want to know what you think. Does this framework ring true to you?
This analysis, of course, it doesn't explain every single migration story. Family ties, cultural history, so many things play a role. But it does offer a powerful lens for why certain large-scale patterns persist, even when they seem to defy the simple logic of wealth rankings.
I think the key takeaway is that migration isn't just about individual failure or, a romantic dream. It's a profound reflection of how opportunity is distributed and how it's restricted across the global order that we have all built.
So the question we want to leave you with is this. If the world's wealthiest, most stable countries choose systems that only welcome those who are already perfectly positioned to succeed, what responsibility do they bear for the pressure that inevitably builds up at the doorsteps of the countries that are still willing to allow a gradual arrival?